I assume.
We can see it just fine. Thank you.
Cool. So I grew up with the privilege of a lot of time spent in the Sierra Nevada. With that came a love for not only experiencing the beauty that it had to offer, but capturing it, whether it's a hike with family or climbing around on big granite walls like this one and being absolutely giddy about it. So this is an area called Lover's Leap that's out in Twin Bridges, California, just south of the Lake Tahoe area. And it's home to just some beautiful granite walls and scenery. And in 2021, when the Caldor fire scorched through it and the surrounding area, it left a snapshot of a landscape that looked pretty bleak right in front of my eyes, having been there both before and after. And, you know, it's understandable to see images like this and feel scared of the destructive power of wildfire. But the thing about snapshots like this is that they're limited. You know, even if I give you a glimpse of its regenerative power, to be worth 1,000 words, the story has to be told. And so what I hope to do for you today is to take you through the eras of wildfire policy and how management of natural ignitions has really evolved over the past century and a half, and where my research is taking the baton from existing research in this space. What I hope you'll come away with today is first that policy history, and you know, all of that means there's inertia behind that. And if you're fuzzy on Newton's laws of motion, consider inertia as the characteristics of an object that dictate how resistant it is to change. It's a function of the mass of an object. It's a function of how that mass is distributed relative to a center point or an axis. And today I'm hopefully going to show how policy has built inertia into the systems of wildfire management. Second, I hope you'll see that coordinating policy from the federal level down to the local level is an ongoing game of three-dimensional chess. And this ultimately is it's the context that inertia sits in. Policy dictates the rules of this game. And as I'll show you, there's many sets of rules that have gone through many iterations over time that are affecting how this game is played. Third, measuring and evaluating the impacts of policy because of that complexity, because of that inertia, is a challenge. Now, first though, what do I mean by management of natural ignitions? For anybody who's not steeped in forestry or in fire, wildfire policy is broken up into kind of two classifications currently. We've got planned ignitions and unplanned ignitions. Planned ignitions being prescribed burns. These are where we deliberately ignite the forest to try to accomplish fuel reduction or some other land management objective. Unplanned ignitions have two subcategories, but human ignited wildfires and naturally ignited. Human ignitions are ones that initially must be suppressed and represents a whole nother conversation for another time. What we're going to be focusing on are these natural ignitions, which, you guessed it, are a naturally occurring event, most often from a lightning strike. And those fires can be managed for both direct and active suppression, as well as indirect tactics that take into account priorities, whether it's firefighter safety, treatment objectives like fuels reduction in forests that are choked with too much fuel after historic suppression for the past century, habitat considerations for important or endangered wildlife, or the protection of infrastructure and private property. And this complexity is what we will build up to today as we go through that history. And second, what do I actually mean by policy? So I like to use these two statements here as a juxtaposition for what we mean by policy and the umbrella that can cast. If you take a look at them, they're pretty much functionally equivalent. On the left, we've got a statement saying, put out all fires by 10 a.m. the next morning. On the right, put a fire out, no later than 24 hours after a wildfire is detected. So for all intents and purposes, suppress fires as quickly as possible and put them out. Two things do separate these policy statements, however. First is the place where they're happening. On the left, we have essentially a memo from the chief of the Forest Service. This is an edict that was sent to regional foresters to dictate how the Forest Service was going to address fire management. On the right, we have a House resolution that Thankfully, this bill is current or this law is stuck in committee and likely will never see the light of day. But I like to bring these up to show just the all shapes and sizes that policy comes in. And, even proposed laws can shift politics and perspectives. Even if that House resolution on the right just scores points with voters, it still can have an effect on this overall landscape. And, it's akin to kind of joining a game already in progress. Knowing the moves that have been taken so far help us decide what happens next. The other thing that separates them is time. The memorandum on the left was famously known as the 10 a.m. policy and was something that existed a little under 90 years ago. And I like to show these to answer the question, well, why do we study history? And I think it's because if we juxtapose these two statements in a vacuum, we look like a dog that's been chasing our tail from a policy standpoint. We're right back where we started. When in reality, these are, two snapshots that hopefully will be colored with a larger story of this push and pull between what modern day policy says that we ought to strive for, which is to live with fire and its complexity, and suppressing fire. And we'll see that back and forth as we progress to the modern day. And today, policy recognizes that complexity. It recognizes both the opportunity that wildfire presents to ecosystems that expect it and the risks that it poses to communities that are affected by it. But how do we actually get to today? And that's the beginnings of my research. This is building upon existing research from the late Jan van Wagtendonk, who himself was a former firefighter, a researcher, and eventually a policy author, who chronicled from essentially the late 19th century to the turn of the millennium, how we've developed in our understanding of fire's role in a landscape and how we manage it. And my research is going to propose two additional eras that we think best capture the intent of the time since his work over the past 20 or so years. Here, it's worth noting some of our limitations with this. First, this is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but rather a look at the major shifts in policy that dictate both management and the philosophy that sits behind that. Appropriations and funding is another part of policy, but that's one that I can speak more to, I think, in Q&A for anyone interested. We'll focus mostly on the paradigms and the philosophies in this presentation. Second, these proposed eras, like any attempt at modern history, are always a work in progress and always open to interpretation. And I don't mean that to dodge the question, but rather to invite credible critiques of this analysis. If folks have an idea that there's a better way to try to classify these things to tell the right story for how we've gotten to today and where we should go from here, we welcome that. Third, I should say, due to the sequestration and oppression of indigenous nations, they are largely going to be absent from this slice of history that I'll take you through. And really, that's one of the true tragedy, just because if we imagine back to the 1870s and this fire protection era that Wagtendonk starts with, you have indigenous nations across the Western US, and especially in the Southwest, living with the complexity of wildfire. They use it practically, they use it ecologically, they use it ceremonially. And European colonization comes in and robs and isolates them, and brought with it a perspective that was essentially ignorant to the frequent fire patterns that were common across the Western United States. And to kind of see how this plays out, I need to introduce you to a guy named Aldo Leopold. For those of you who aren't aware, Aldo Leopold was regarded as a pioneer of conservation biology, of wildlife science, and Leopold and his contemporaries were a part of the European educated crew of people that were starting to dictate land management for the United States and wrestling with that question of, what do we do about fire? Do we live with it? Do we use it? Do we suppress it? And the education and research of his time is largely influenced by that European experience. Guys like Gifford Pinchot and Bernard Ferneau all had a perspective coming from parts of the world where wildfire doesn't happen as frequently as it does in the American West. And so as a result, we see that play out in 1920. Leopold writes in a publication that lighting fire to prevent more severe fire, which they kind of called light burning at the time, would more likely destroy productive stands of timber than protect them. And in doing so, he showed both his ignorance and his arrogance, saying that it would be absurd to assume that these indigenous nations that have lived here for hundreds, if not thousands of years, were doing this with any sense of conservation in mind. So fire was being talked about, but it was being talked about purely from a standpoint of resource extraction that was common of those times, as the timber industries were logging large swaths of the American West. But we weren't really talking about it ecologically, because in the early 20th century, the field of general ecology, let alone fire ecology, is still very, very young. And so outside of that indigenous wisdom that was very quickly sequestered, the evidence to support light burning or practices like it was very scarce. Now, to Leopold's credit, a mere 4 years later, after he spent time observing the Southwest, he says, our previous assumption rejected the plain story on the face of nature. Like a good scientist, he allowed observations that challenged his preconceptions to change his mind when he observed what is now the Gila and the Carson National Forests in New Mexico. Leopold was ahead of his contemporaries in a lot of ways, and before really academic research could mature and catch up to his personal inertia, his personal paradigm shift, we see wildfires like the Peshtigo fire in 1871 that kills over 1,000 people in modern-day Wisconsin, fires in the Adirondacks in 1903 and 1908 that capture national attention because it's right in New England's backyard in the upstate New York area. And then we get the big blowup of 1910 that scorched millions of acres from British Columbia all the way through the American Rockies. And at this point, if any of you are wondering if the debate hadn't been settled, don't, because 5 policies over the next couple decades established the priority of and the funding for fire suppression, that we need to put fire out, it's too destructive, with our friend the 10 a.m. policy making its appearance in 1935. Now you'll notice there's only 4 policies up here. That's because all of this was thrust upon the Forest Service, which basically is created with the 1905 Transfer Act, and then immediately charged with managing 20 million acres of land. So you can imagine the deer in headlights that they probably had at that notion, given their relative infancy as a land management agency. But let's take a step back and let's come back to this notion of inertia. So the resources appropriated to fire suppression are significant. They add a lot of proverbial mass into our system of land and fire management. And we've also increased the complexity by adding agencies into this equation as the Transfer Act creates the Forest Service as we know it today. But at the very least, it's a united front. There's a relative concentration around the goal at the time. Everyone had the same objective of let's go put fires out. And that's much easier to generate and change momentum within this system. And the momentum that gets generated, that unified front is entrenched into society through the 30s and 40s as New Deal policies targeted putting men to work in the midst of the Depression, with the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, sending thousands of men into the backcountry to build roads and fight fire. We get the smoke jumper program in 1939 that essentially created paratrooper firefighters to jump out of planes into the backcountry to fight fire. And then came propaganda of World War II. And so we threw military models, military industries developed from World War I through the Depression into World War II at the forest en masse with this singular mission that gets cemented into our modern understanding through Smokey Bear of prevent forest fires, prevent forest fires, prevent forest fires. So that sets the tone for decades, and it's not until we get well into the 60s, into the experimentation era, that we see a departure from this paradigm. And experimentation, I think, is very appropriate, given that at this time we've got the Beatles leading the British invasion, transforming music. We've got the Vietnam War generating dissent for military industries and occupations during the Summer of Love. And we're going to go back to the Leopolds, because Aldo Leopold's son leads a particularly important committee. So Aldo's son Starker, turns out he was a forester and a conservationist himself. And in 1963, he chairs a committee tasked by the Secretary of the Interior with reporting on wildlife management in the national parks. And they took the idea or the charge of looking at wildlife management and expanded it and said, okay, let's look at the whole ecosystems of these parks. And what they found was that, many of these parks went through periods of indiscriminate extraction of resources or destruction of resources. And then when entering the park system, they swung all the way to the other side of the spectrum to equally unnatural protection completely from fires. And I like to point out this bit at the end here that, he even calls out in the 60s something that we're wrestling with today of, in order to safely reintroduce fire to forests that have had an enormous buildup of fuels over decades and even, centuries, require kind of multi-stage treatments if we're going to then let fire be reintroduced safely. So they took this really holistic view to basically say ecosystems are complex dynamic forces, and they called for an expansion into the research into wildfire and what role it plays in that complexity. And so the combination of Leopold's or his committee's report and a growing array of that fire ecology research that's had a chance to mature a little bit as we get into the mid-60s leads the Park Service to become the first agency to codify the ecological importance of fire in 1968. And at this point in time, they're calling it prescribed natural fire. This idea has gone by a number of different names, from managed fire to wildland fire use to resource objective fire, et cetera. And at this time, it's being called prescribed natural fire because, like a human ignited prescribed burn, managing a naturally ignited fire under this policy required a formal prescription. So it's a bit conservative, but an important incremental step in reintroducing fire to the landscape. And these programs start to pop up at parks and monuments across the country. The Forest Service follows in 1974 when Henry de Bruin, the Director of Fire and Aviation Management at the time, says, all right, we're going to switch from fire control to fire management. And the former being easy to communicate, easy to understand, easy to execute. The latter, not so much. And all of a sudden now that united front through the first half of the century is made a little less so. And I like to also point out that that 10 a.m. policy officially gets scrapped in the end of this era. But now, so why would it be the case that the complexity is coming in, that we don't have that unified front anymore? Well, consider the challenge of jurisdiction considering mission statements. Wildfire goes where fuels, weather, and topography tell it to go. It doesn't really care about the boundaries that are drawn by humans between states, counties, agencies. And so fires can hop between national parks and national forests, and the missions of those organizations can differ in nuanced but important ways. The Park Service, has a mission statement to preserve unimpaired these resources so that we can enjoy it and have future generations enjoy it. Whereas the Forest Service, because of its multi-use sustained yield mission statement, still has elements of harvesting, cultivation, and productivity in its mission statement. And so that starts to create challenges and potential friction between groups where they don't necessarily align on their mission statements, and so extra coordination is necessary to do so. And thankfully, the groundwork has already started to be laid at this point as the National Interagency Fire Center gets created in 1965 to tackle that exact problem. It's a group that sets standards in terms of organizational structure, in terms of operational standards, and how we define and communicate concepts. And then later in this decade, we get 2 additional laws that also have an enormous impact. We have the Federal Land Policy Management Act and National Forest Management Act, both coming in 1976. Now, FLPMA and NIFMA, as they're called by the select few nerds like me who use them often enough to warrant an abbreviation, they set a crucial mandate for both the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture. They mandate the creation and regular revision of management plans that define both the priorities and the tactics for each land unit under their control as to how they're going to steward their domain. And a part of that being, how are you going to deal with the the challenge of wildfire. And this is meant to defer to local authorities, I think, rightfully so, that regional units will have a better sense of the ecosystems and what they need, and the people and communities there and what they value and prioritize. But these land management plans have some important criteria that they have to meet. First, they must be interdisciplinary. So at this point now, we're talking about including not just the people who manage and put out fires, the firefighters, the smoke jumpers, all of that population, but we've got considerations about wildlife, considerations about watersheds, considerations about private property and social values and stuff like that. We've got to revise them at least every 15 years at a minimum. And most significantly, they need to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA is its own beast that if you hear anybody talk about it, it's almost always in a negative connotation for how much of a beast it is. And we're not going to get too far into that today, but what matters is this. The environmental impact statement, or EIS, that's required with these land management plans takes a very long time, ranging from 3 to 6 years, depending on the land management agency. And we'll soon find out what that has done and what impact that has had on policy today. So back to this idea of inertia, we're adding complexity, and now we're on multiple fronts. Like we talked about with this interagency and interdisciplinary approach, we are more distributed geographically, bureaucratically, and that's adding mass to the system. And it's a reality. It's not necessarily a problem. Different ecosystems, different communities need different plans. But just to call out that the inertia of policy now gets bigger and harder to shift now that we have more of this mass involved. But at the very least, we've seen progress. Fire's importance is now codified. Now, like any paradigm shift, there's almost always a course correction, a pull of the pendulum back, so to speak. And that comes in the reevaluation era as we get into the 70s and 80s. So a couple of events really, I think, are emblematic of the challenges that we were starting to realize in this space. First is the Ozell fire in Rocky Mountain National Park in 1978. And so this is a fire that was managed for resource benefit, was monitored and allowed to perform its function for over a month with no issue, until drastic changes in weather brought high winds and caused it to escape control and threaten communities. And a report on the incident confirms that gaps were both in the plan itself, as well as in implementing sound parts of the plan that led to its escape and the risk to communities. And so managers are starting to realize that, okay, while suppressing fire was difficult, reintroducing it is likely even more so. In the late 80s, we get fires in Yellowstone, multiple fires that combine to scorch hundreds of thousands of acres, significant enough that it captures international attention. And though some research proposed both at the time and even today looking back that those fires were aligned with the fire regime that ecosystem expected and would yield positive benefits, the media depiction of the event at that time casts doubt on the efficacy of these kinds of strategies. And so, again, remember, sometimes it's not just the letter of the law that matters, it's how that law gets interpreted and how that law gets communicated to, the general public. With the, following the Yellowstone fires, the DOI and the DOA both come out and jointly suspend all fire management programs until new management plans are written, given events like these. And so that takes us into the maturation era. We're starting to say, we're having that reconciling of, okay, what works, what doesn't. Unfortunately, this era is largely dominated by the tragedy that takes place within it, which is the South Canyon fire in 1994 in Colorado. In a year where 34 firefighters died on wildland fires, this incident alone took 14 of them. And once again, this brings questions about protocols, their implementation, and especially around the question of firefighter safety. Were we cutting corners for the sake of efficiency at the expense of, safety of the people who that work is dependent upon. And this time, rather than simply rewriting regional plans, this triggers a full-scale overhaul of wildland fire management policy, the first largely since the policies that came through in the 70s. And this policy, among its many directives, emphasized seeking cross-jurisdictional coordination, trying to reduce that friction because interagency work turns out much harder than we even thought it was. We need to align with all of the land management plans that are down at the ground. And we need to create an internal culture in land management agencies that supports implementing these programs. And I think these last two are really worth considering, because the second one, we see increasingly this deference to regional authority as that de facto Bible, the concrete priorities and tactics that will actually define how things are going to get done when it comes to stewarding the land and trying to reintroduce fire. And the second being that as we try to make that shift, old habits die hard. Not everyone has the luxury of Leopold's observations and his ability to, shift his personal inertia. And so there's still some holding on to those fire suppression mindsets that are steeped in the tradition of Smokey Bear that are much simpler to execute and much simpler to communicate. Before that policy really, gets out of its infancy, we get yet another focusing event that sheds lights on more gaps in the system, which is the Cerro Grande fire that was an escaped prescribed fire in New Mexico. It burned hundreds of homes and structures after it escaped control. It threatened the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the Bandelier National Monument. And while we make a distinction about ignition source when it comes to policy of human ignited, prescribed fire, naturally ignited, Cerro Grande is an important reminder, as was the Hermit's Peaks fire more recently, that any wildfire, regardless of the ignition source, can affect the policy landscape that all of this ultimately falls under. Congressional testimony on this incident argued that once again, there's gaps in procedures and implementation, and we're left with questions about, are agencies really ready to tackle the complexity of this, or is more training, more communication, more funding needed? Which ultimately the answer to that is consistently yes. And so that interagency group was tasked with writing, the 95 policy, is reconvened to update it, and that subsequent policy takes us into the modern era, where we've identified two additional eras to emerge within this that I've dubbed fire classification and operational flexibility. And before we get into why these names and why 2009, let's take a brief moment to look at that review and update of 1995 policy, which I cleverly call the 2001 update. So the 2001 update has over a dozen directives, but three are particularly important for our topic today. The first is its directive around the response to wildland fire. Going back, as I mentioned before, even a natural ignition still had to be managed with a formal prescription and all of the scrutiny and protocols that go into a prescribed fire. In 2001, we see that scrapped, and now we're saying circumstances and context is everything, that our response should be dictated based off of the ecological, the social, the legal consequences of our management actions as we manage that fire. And then second, we've got communication and education and evaluation. Both were items that had no explicit mention in terms of the directives within 1995, but are now being added in 2001. And I like to call this out just because, if you think back to what we talked about in the 70s, you have Henry de Bruin saying we're transitioning to fire management, which is difficult to communicate, difficult to understand. And only until we get to 2001 do we finally see that codified in policy to say we need to make a concerted effort on internal and external fronts to improve our communication, improve our training, come up with a clear set of terminology that then can allow the public to better understand what this complexity looks like, what it means for them, and how to drive buy-in for it ultimately. And then evaluation in the sense that, if you're going to analyze the effects of policy, you've got to have a means of determining, not only defining success, but then measuring it and being able to look back and determine how effective things have been. So I'll pause here to go into one of the analogies that I really like to describe this. And this comes from my academic research grandfather. My advisor, Kat Edgley's PhD advisor, Travis Pavelio, came up with this analogy of the three-dimensional chess within the context of fire management. And so I'm going to talk about it in this context as we go through policy. So we have these, layers that I set out before, but you can kind of think of these layers as landscapes where we have chessboards. And, whether it's the social landscape, the political landscape, the ecological landscape, the actual ecosystem itself, those are going to be, manifested in these boards, so to speak. And we as individuals, as stakeholders, we're, the pieces on the board, and we have policies that dictate what our available moves are and how we can affect not just the game of dealing with the wildfire crisis and living with wildfire on a single board, but across boards and, up and down this hierarchy. You can, think of this, that when you get down to the regional level, you've got not just the ecosystems there, you've got local priorities, you've got regional units that may have their own organizational culture, their own expertise, or lack thereof with certain types of these strategies. So you can kind of think of it more of different shaped boards. It's not just a homogeneous look, but we've got a very, very complicated landscape that, in order to coordinate across, it's imperative that aligning across these boards and figuring out how best to, if we change policy at an interagency level, how does that affect the regional level and vice versa. And in this context, I'd like to speak to an example that I think is mired in this complexity and how muddled this can get, that communication is such a struggle, and even when you do it right, it can still backfire and have negative consequences. So in 2021, in the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest, the tamarack fire was ignited by a lightning strike. And when it first started, the Forest Service made the assessment that, based off of the steep topography that would be a risk to firefighters, the weather conditions that were on the near term, being relatively mild, as well as the fact that at the time we were steeped in a heinous fire season where 20 other large fires were burning across the country at this time. And fire management resources are oftentimes at the whim of what those priorities are. And so the Forest Service, in how stretched thin it was, made the decision that this fire was going to be monitored, but not actively suppressed. Then, days or weeks later, I forget the exact timeline, but winds kicked up unexpectedly, drove the fire beyond the expected containment, ended up burning 20 structures. It threatened communities. And this is the fire that actually influences the writing of House Resolution 6903 that we looked at earlier. The tamarack fire was the spark that lit the fire, so to speak, in congressional authorities to say, well, why did you decide to let it burn? And despite the fact that this isn't even a fire that I would classify as, a fire being managed for resource benefit or for, reintroducing fire to the landscape, it was merely a tactical decision that they couldn't afford to put resources towards. You can still have that reaction in the public. And again, that's where, like the Cerro Grande fire and the examples before, it's not just the policies that are related to natural ignitions that have an effect in this space. So coming back to the timeline, this idea, or this game of three-dimensional chess, we get to 2009, which is this intended inflection point, and I'll explain why I say intended in a moment. But essentially, after the 2001 update was released, there's still the question looming of what, we've seen what we need to do, but how do we do it? Managers wanted more guidance on how to put these higher level, more abstract visions into concrete action. And so guidance documents come in 2003 and 2009, and you'll see why I've paired them here, which is that in 2003, coming out of the 2001 review and update, we get some operational statements, the most important of which for our conversation today is that only one management objective gets applied to a wildland fire. You can manage it for resource benefit, as it was being called in policy at the time, or suppression, not both and not concurrently. Now, as you probably imagine, the 2001 policy, we're trying to say fire response is context dependent, but here we're, and this is why we call it the fire classification error, we're trying to put wildfire into these mutually exclusive kind of discrete states that make it easier to document and communicate, but turned out to be way too restrictive. And so then in 2009, we get revised guidance that comes out and says, okay, managers can have, and this is why we call this, inflection point leading into the era of operational flexibility. They have the flexibility to manage fires for one or more objectives. It still needs to be based off of the direction from land management plans, but we're now saying both at the federal level and at the interagency level that these objectives are affected and should be adapted to dynamic forces in the ecosystem. Now, I say an intended inflection point because that alignment and that shift on paper, looking at that, makes sense as, yeah, that's a pretty significant paradigm shift. But if you think again about that array of policy and how, just because we make a rule change at that interagency level, the pieces of the board and, the rules at play have to also be aligned further down at the agency and the regional level to make sure that that vision turns into execution. And unfortunately, lags at the regional level can delay the policy's impact. As we saw before, management plans, thanks to NEPA and environmental impact statements, are very, very time consuming, which has led to multiple units across the country struggling to keep them up to date. A lot of policies have moved past that 15-year window and have since expired. And this can essentially bind managers to out-of-date strategies. If their management plan was written prior to 2001, it may be missing all of this updated policy vision. And so while we see that logical inflection point in the interagency strategy, until we then see some of the regional lag catch up and a lot of those land management plans be written with that paradigm in mind, it'll be difficult for us to determine the impact of that policy. And we're lucky here in the Southwest that a lot of our land management plans have been updated and thankfully reflect this updated paradigm. And it's nice to be in an area that's leading the way in that front. But it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all a problematic look for this management strategy. So I took this photo from the top of Kendrick Mountain looking towards the San Francisco peaks there outside of Flagstaff. And Kendrick Mountain was a part of the area that was affected by the 2017 boundary fire. And the boundary fire was one that I think is, compared to the Tamarack fire, an example of what it looks like when things go right and what this strategy can look like going forward, which is that a lightning strike happened and topographical considerations caused, fire lines to be drawn where we could keep firefighters safe. Wildlife experts were consulted based off of the needs of important species like the Mexican spotted owl or any other species that rely upon fire for foraging or could be at risk in terms of their habitat if it gets too out of hand. We considered the private property that was around this area and protected those to make sure that the individual members of the public that were tied to those assets were appropriately considered. And so all of that came together in the right kind of communication, the right kinds of networks that allowed that coordination to take place, at least on this incident from start to finish, such that everybody came home safe and the land management objectives were largely successful. So again, that these snapshots that I've tried to show you today are intended to try to give you that whole perspective. And this snapshot that I showed you earlier, it's actually a top-down view at the longleaf pine in southeast Georgia, where I had the pleasure of participating in a prescribed fire training exchange, where I learned one of the ways of things being, or one of the ways in which fire kind of paints its effect on the face of nature. If you look at the longleaf pine, not from the top, you see what its fire adaptation has become. That it uses these long leaves to insulate itself to protect that bud that is its source of growth. And so hopefully today, as we've gone through these stories and this timeline, it's given you a sense of how this has developed, and ultimately how the current state of policy is affected by that history and where we can go from here. So again, the takeaways from today: history comes with that inertia, and that inertia has gotten more and more complex over time as we play in Pavelio's three-dimensional game of chess that he calls it, and that coordinating is paramount to making sure that those visions turn into realities, and that measuring and evaluating impacts of that policy is going to continue to be a challenge. Some next steps in terms of my own research for this, for anybody who's interested, we've got a white paper with a more detailed history and impacts, as well as a summary fact sheet to come. And then some questions that I myself want to answer with some of my research are, how do we define and measure success on these fires, and how are we interpreting those definitions and measurements? Because we want to know, how do we best support people and organizations that are tasked with this challenge, and how do we best drive buy-in with the right mix of metrics and incentives as we move forward, so that we all can continue to keep capturing and experiencing the landscape as it's meant to. So thank you so much for the time today, and I'm happy to entertain any and all questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott, for the excellent presentation. I really appreciated hearing everything that you ran through. We'll go ahead and kick it off with a question from Patricia, who asked, with so much forest land in private hands, how can policy be translated to the private sector? And at what point does fire management policy need to become forest health policy?
Yeah, in terms of the end of that, the fire management policy and forest health policy are intertwined. I don't think you can really have one without the other. But in terms of the private land ownership, because that's something that's the case much more as you head east of the Rockies and east of the Mississippi, is you have a much higher concentration of private land ownership in forested areas. And I think it's ultimately about not only, aligning on how it gets communicated and the terms that we use, because, like I said, there's so many different terms that have been used for this idea over time, that there needs to be something consistent for people to gravitate towards and to have that shared reality set. But then also, I think that plays into hopefully some of the changes that that I personally would like to see in terms of how we build financial structures around these tasks. How do we build incentive structures such that private owners can get tax credits for doing thinning treatments on their properties, and steps like that leverage the incentive structures of things like the private sector, where if you can speak to their wallet, you're probably more likely to get them to do something, but then also have the right message that speaks to our humanity and the general public.
So a complicated answer. Cameron asked, are there NEPA exemptions for wildfire management to ease the burden of updating documentation?
So that's one of the things that has happened a lot and has been an ongoing attempt essentially since the passing of NIFMA and FLIPMA in 1976. So you have essentially the planning rules that establish what's actually the nuts and bolts of how and what needs to go into these plans. And the most recent addendum or update to that planning rule came in 2012 with the idea in mind of trying to expedite amendments to plans so that they aren't as much of a time-intensive lift for situations where it's appropriate. NEPA has this notion of categorical exclusions where depending on the type of treatment or the activity, we've identified certain things that we say, yeah, that can be fast-tracked because it's a relatively low risk of causing environmental harm if we don't take a diligent approach towards, incorporating best available science and letting the public have a chance to comment on it as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you a question that is maybe getting into your opinion. So if you want to skip over it, just let me know. But I noticed that in your presentation, there are a number of parallels between the policies of the late 80s when burns were suspended until regional plans could be rewritten, and today when the USDA has just responded to the severe fires of last year by enacting that pause on prescribed burns and now requiring all existing burn plans to be rewritten. It feels like these resets react to gaps in procedures and implementation in the system. And so it feels like we're at a place in time where reactionary policy may tip either way. So what I wanted to ask you was, based on the history that you've run through today, how do you imagine that current day ecological and political realities may influence policy over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I don't think we'll ever escape the reactionary nature of things like this, because I think to a certain extent, I think we've proven just as a society, regardless of the cataclysm, that cataclysms are usually the things that we react to create, like, you know, full-blown overhauls to policy to try to, like, as one giant unit, shift the inertia. I don't think we'll entirely escape that, especially if, you know, climate change continues to affect severity of fires in that way. There's always going to be that. But, you know, the more we build both formal and informal networks to communicate the strategy, like, I think in a lot of situations like this, like, we don't give the public enough credit if we, like, actually dive into a little bit of the details and you know, need to have a consistent message, obviously, but give them the benefit of the doubt that they'll be able to keep up with us on some of the complexity that we try to talk about. Because, you know, I go back and forth on, like, is there really one term that we could come up with that would encapsulate this type of management strategy where we're considering so many different angles, you know, both ecological and, you know, human issues. So I think so much of it is just going to depend on how well the coordination and how we can be proactive in getting managers to relay to researchers, to relay to policymakers, to relay to the public, what, you know, how do we put the glue in place to make sure that we can at least be aligned on our understanding?
Yeah, and I really appreciate that you bring up that education piece, because it feels like that's in so many aspects of fire and fire science, that's such an important piece moving forward.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, not just for the general public, but for the people that are working in those organizations too. I mean, you know, there's no guarantee that your average firefighter who comes into the Forest Service has the, you know, an up-to-date background in terms of forestry and forest science to know the nuances of fire management. And so, you know, the more that you can, you know, it's like anything, when you educate, you got to start with the kiddos and let that, you know, make its way through generationally. And I think there's, you know, you can attack that on multiple fronts. So it's not just like wait for the young generation to come in and start calling the shots. But yeah, finding the right places to pinpoint that education so that it's in the hands of people who can then communicate it in ways that your average person can understand, absent of all of the jargon that's common to an industry like forestry.
All right, so in the few minutes that we have left, I wanted to ask one question about the actual way that managed fire is approached, I guess. So as fire behavior continues to become more extreme and firefighter safety continues to be prioritized, how has managed fire and fire management at large coexisted with protection needs such as point protection and community preparedness?
Yeah, well, one thing that I think is important to call out is that, like, this strategy of managing with this complexity is very far in the minority in terms of the number of fires that happen. The vast majority of fires get put out. So it's a small subset that is becoming larger as we understand more of the opportunities where we can reintroduce fire in that way. I think you know, as climate change continues to move and you know, it gets more and more difficult to the point where, you know, the fire management strategy sometimes with a raging crown fire is to just get out of its way because you can't do anything about it. You know, that that should be coupled with the message that has been resonant since Starker Leopold mentioned it in the 1963 committee report, that incremental steps to make it safe for that fire to come back into the landscape are really important. And so though it's not, though it's not directly putting fire to the landscape, the investments and the buy-in that we can get around mechanical thinning, especially for those private homeowners, as Patricia's question alludes to, that's paramount to making sure that you can get enough thinning done that as the wildland urban interface continues to expand out into forested areas, that those areas can, have a certain degree of safety, if only just so that the insurance industry doesn't crater as a result of it.
Yeah, a lot of this really speaks to the current moment, so we'll see where it goes in a few years. There have been a number of comments really saying thank you so much for your presentation and complimenting you on it, and people are really interested in knowing where they'll be able to find that white paper when it's published. Can you just let us know?
Yeah, so it'll be with the Ecological Restoration Institute. I will certainly share it with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. So if you're a part of any of those distributions, it'll make its way out that way. Otherwise, yeah, the ERI at Northern Arizona University has its repository of white papers, and it will make its way there once it's ready for public consumption.
All right, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and post your contact information in the chat for anyone who wants to reach out, wants to continue asking you questions or get involved in any of your future research. So thank you so much for coming on today, giving this excellent presentation and giving us your time. Thank you to everybody for joining us on the call today. And I look forward to continuing to work with you in the future, Scott. Yeah,
of course. Thank you so much, Rachel. This has been lovely. And yeah, thank you for facilitating it all and making sure the nuts and bolts are all, no squeaky wheels while we're trying to do this. So I appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Bye, everyone.